The fire crackled softly, sending sparks spiraling into the starless sky. The rangers huddled closer, not just for warmth, but for the comfort of the light. Tonight, the forest felt different, darker, more oppressive. The usual night sounds were absent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I glanced around at the faces illuminated by the flickering flames, knowing this was a night to share the most important rule of all. "There's a reason Rule 20 stands above the rest," I began, my voice low, almost as if I didn't want the forest to hear. The forest isn't just a place. It's alive, and it feeds on fear and despair. Once it has you, there's no escape. The memory of that winter came flooding back, chilling me more than the cold air ever could. It was during one of the harshest winters I'd ever faced in Whispering Pines. The forest was blanketed in snow, the trees heavy with ice. The landscape was deceptively beautiful, a serene white death mask hiding something far more sinister. I had been on a routine patrol, the crunch of snow under my boots the only sound in the stillness. But even then, something felt off. The usual sense of peace I found in the forest was absent, replaced by an undercurrent of unease. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the forest was closing in around me. It wasn't long before I began to feel it, the sensation of being watched. Not by the usual wildlife, but by something far more ancient and malevolent. The trees seemed to shift in my peripheral vision, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers, reaching for me. I tried to shake the feeling, focusing on the path ahead. But the further I walked, the more the path seemed to change, twisting and turning in ways I didn't recognize. What should have been a familiar route was now leading me deeper into the woods, away from any landmarks I knew. That's when the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on my mind. But the more I listened, the more I realized these were no ordinary sounds. The whispers were faint, like voices carried on the breeze, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. They were taunting, mocking, and filled with a deep, gnawing hunger. I quickened my pace, trying to outwalk the fear that was slowly tightening its grip on my heart. But the forest seemed to move with me, the trees closing ranks, blocking out the sky. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel the presence of something dark and predatory, lurking just out of sight. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but the path behind me had vanished, swallowed by the shifting trees. Panic set in, cold and sharp, as I realized the forest was leading me where it wanted me to go. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning my lungs as I fought to keep moving. Then, as if in response to my fear, the forest came alive. The snow beneath my feet began to melt, revealing dark, gnarled roots that twisted and pulsed with a sickly light. The trees seemed to groan and creak, their branches forming grotesque shapes, faces appearing in the bark. Faces twisted in eternal screams of agony. These were the souls of those who had been claimed by the forest, trapped in its embrace, their despair feeding its insatiable hunger. I stumbled, my legs refusing to carry me any further. The whispers had become a deafening chorus, the faces in the trees contorting in mockery of my terror. I was alone, lost in a living nightmare with no way out. The forest had me, and I could feel it savoring my fear. But something inside me refused to give up. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to my feet, pushing through the pain and the despair that threatened to drown me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving. The forest fought back, the roots rising up to ensnare me, the trees pressing closer. But I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until my vision blurred, until the whispers were nothing more than a distant echo. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The trees parted, revealing a familiar path. I stumbled onto it, too exhausted to question how I had found it. As I stepped out of the forest's grasp, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders, the malevolent presence receding into the darkness. The forest had let me go, this time. When I finally reached the safety of the ranger station, I collapsed, my body trembling with the aftershocks of fear. But I knew I had been lucky. The forest had shown me mercy, but it wouldn't forget. It was alive, it was hungry, and it was always watching, waiting for its next victim. "The forest is alive," I said, my voice shaking with the memory. "It feeds on fear and despair, and once it has claimed you, there is no escape. Your screams will echo through the trees for all eternity." The fire crackled softly as my words hung in the air, the reality of the rule sinking in. Whispering Pines was no ordinary forest. It was a living entity, a predator that thrived on the terror of those who dared to trespass within its borders, and those who ventured too far would never return. The fire had burned down to a dull glow, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into the surrounding darkness. The night had grown colder, and the forest beyond the firelight felt like it was closing in, listening. It was time to tell the rangers about the lost patrol, a cautionary tale that had been passed down through the ranks for years. "This isn't just my story," I began, the words heavy with the weight of what was to come. "There was a time, years ago, when a group of rangers went out on a routine patrol and never came back. The Lost Patrol was made up of experienced rangers, men and women who knew the forest well, or so they thought. It was early spring, the snow just beginning to melt, leaving the ground muddy and treacherous. The patrol had set out early in the morning, planning to cover a wide area that day, checking on trails and making sure nothing was out of the ordinary. But from the moment they entered the deeper parts of Whispering Pines, things began to go wrong. The first sign was the silence. At first, they brushed it off, just a lull in the usual sounds of the forest. But as the hours passed and the silence deepened, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The birds didn't sing, the wind didn't rustle the leaves, and even the crunch of their boots seemed muffled, as if the forest was absorbing the sound. By midday, the unease had settled into the bones of every ranger on the patrol. They tried to stay focused, sticking to their assigned routes, but the sense of being watched only grew stronger. The trees seemed taller, more menacing, their branches reaching out like claws. The path that had been so clear in the morning began to twist and turn in unfamiliar ways, leading them deeper into the forest instead of toward their destination. Then came the whispers. At first, the rangers thought it was just the wind, but these whispers were different. They seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing off the trees, carried on the breeze like a dark melody. The whispers were unintelligible, a language they didn't understand, but the tone was clear, taunting, malicious, and filled with a deep hunger. Panic began to set in as the rangers realized they were lost. The forest had closed in around them, the path back no longer visible. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, gnawing at their resolve. It was as if the forest was alive, feeding off their fear, driving them deeper into its grasp. One by one, the rangers began to falter. Their confident strides turned to hesitant steps, their calm exteriors cracked by the weight of the fear that was clawing at their minds. They tried to call out to one another, but their voices were swallowed by the whispers, their words turning to echoes that seemed to mock them. Then the forest began to change. The trees around them twisted and warped, their trunks bending into grotesque shapes. Faces appeared in the bark, contorted in expressions of agony and despair. These were not just trees. They were the remnants of souls the forest had claimed before. Their screams trapped in the wood, eternally crying out for release. The rangers tried to stay together, but the forest had other plans. The ground beneath them shifted, roots rising up to trip them, pulling them apart. The trees closed in, separating them, each ranger finding themselves alone in the darkness, with only the whispers and the ghostly faces for company. Desperation turned to madness as the rangers realized there was no way out. The forest had claimed them, fed on their fear, and now it was dragging them into the depths of its darkness. Their screams echoed through the trees, mingling with the whispers, becoming part of the forest's eternal song of despair. Days later, when the rangers didn't return, a search party was sent out. They scoured the forest, calling out the names of their comrades, but the forest was silent once more. No whispers, no screams, just the oppressive stillness that had marked the beginning of the patrol's end. The search party found no trace of the rangers, no tracks, no gear, nothing. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. But those who had ventured deep enough into the forest claimed they heard something. A faint whisper carried on the wind, and the distant echo of screams trapped within the trees. The story of the Lost Patrol became a warning, passed down through the ranks. The forest is alive, and it feeds on fear and despair. Once it has claimed you, there is no escape, and your screams will echo through the trees for all eternity. As I finished the tale, the fire flickered, casting eerie shadows on the faces around me. The rangers sat in silence, the reality of the story sinking in. Whispering Pines was no ordinary forest, and the Lost Patrol was proof that even the most experienced could fall victim to its malevolence. The night grew darker, the silence of the forest around us more profound. I could see in their eyes that they understood now. This wasn't just a story. The forest was alive, and it was always hungry.